Where will it all end in Venezuela? A day of dueling demonstrations with mass rallies by the opposition, the follow-up to several weeks of sometimes deadly protests that have spiraled despite President Maduro's decision to force his own Supreme Court to back down on plans to place itself above the opposition-controlled legislature. Stoking the tension this Wednesday are counter-demonstrations, but also accusations of a Washington-fueled coup plot, plans to arm pro-government militias, and this week's loyalty oath by the Army Chief of Staff to Hugo Chávez's successor. How to stop the spiral in an oil-rich nation beset by hyperinflation and mass shortages of food, medicine, electricity, and more. How should regional partners react? Even Maduro's allies have grown worried. Russia requisitioning a Venezuelan oil tanker over unpaid bills. We're talking about a nation hailed by leftists the world over for its use of that oil money to lift millions out of poverty. What's left of a legacy that's still admired here by France's far-left presidential candidate? Today in the France 24 debate, Venezuela's downward spiral. With us, writer Vincent Olive. He's the author of Who Killed Simon Bolivar. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
From Caracas, Lucas Kerner, journalist with Venezuela Analysis. Welcome to the France 24 debate.
Great, thanks to be here.
Daniel Landsberg Rodriguez teaches at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Nice to be with us from Chicago.
Thank you for having me. It's always a lot of fun.
And from Washington, Juan Carlos Hidalgo of the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The opposition's called it the mother of all marches, protesters demanding state gubernatorial elections that had been slated for last year, a halt on the security crackdown, and respect for the autonomy of the opposition-led legislature.
We'll reach victory with this protest. This is the second independence of Venezuela. Today is the day. This is going to be the day we have been waiting for, longing for.
We came here to protest and support our Comandante Maduro. There are no Yankees here. We, the oil workers, are here with our President Maduro. Chavez lives on and the nation lives on.
A day of dueling protests. Vincent Olive, your thoughts on how it's all playing out in the streets this Wednesday?
Well, the reports that I have been able to follow on social media speak of a lot of violence ramping up of the repression of the marches in Caracas right now. There's already somebody who has been wounded by a gunshot. So this protest has been received with a lot more violence and a lot more repression on the hand of the government than the ones that took place in 2016 and 2014. They've ramped up the repression to levels that would not be acceptable, in my opinion, in a democratic country in Europe, for example.
All right, you heard that woman there talking about how they're going to achieve their goals. What will these protests achieve? Well,
there's a lot of people asking for different things, but I think the most coherent message that has been put out there is that the opposition just wants the respect of the dialogue that took place in December. This means that they want the National Assembly to be recognized. They want freedom for political prisoners. They want the elections in December to take place because they haven't yet. And they want the establishment of a humanitarian corridor that would allow other countries to send us medicines and food, and it has been blocked by the government.
Lucas Kerner, your thoughts on those demands?
I think that it's important to really take a step back and not look at only social media reports. I mean, certainly, yes, there was an individual who, during an opposition protest in San Bernardino, Caracas, who was shot in the head and wounded at the protest. However, it remains totally unclear the circumstances that the eyewitnesses accused motorcyclists, though informal police sources have said that it might have been a robbery, which is very common in Caracas. I think it's also important to note that I think that, first of all, the opposition protests have not, I think repression is, I think we need to put that in perspective in a lot of ways, because I think that when the opposition declares a protest to march to, for example, the center of Caracas, the National Ombudsman Office, without an official permit from the mayor's office of that particular sector. And we remember 15 years ago, last week, the opposition also announced a protest towards the western part of Caracas, which is largely pro-government, and in the midst of counter demonstrations by government supporters, and the result was a coup attempt during that period. So clearly, there's the government cannot permit, from its perspective, that the opposition marches to the western part of the city, because the protests this past 2 weeks have been very violent. I mean, we look at the
right. But what about the
demands?
What about the demands that Vincent was talking about by the opposition?
Yeah, the demands, I think that many of them are legitimate. Like holding regional elections is absolutely legitimate demand. The government should have held it. However, holding early presidential elections is a very constitutionally dubious demand, because in the Constitution it's specified that the president is elected in 2018. The new elections are held in 2018. I mean, the reality is that the opposition, since the election of Maduro in 2013, which it refused to recognize, and Enrique Capriles called for his supporters to discharge their rage in the streets, leading to 7 deaths, and subsequently the later round of violent protests in 2014, the Guarimbas, saw 43 people killed, the majority security forces and bystanders. The opposition since 2002 onwards has refused to recognize the legitimacy of an elected government, elected socialist government. So we can criticize the particular policies of this government all we want, but let's recognize it was duly elected, and that makes it different from the government in Brazil, because we're not talking about Brazil, where there is extreme violent repression, of protesters. We're not talking about, Mexico, where 100,000 people have died, where, the legitimacy of that government is clearly in question. We're talking about Venezuela, which does have an elected government, which does have a constitution. And indeed, you have a violent opposition. And yes, there have been protesters who have been killed. There have been 2 protesters who have been killed by police. And you have
a constitution where we saw the Supreme Court had to be reined in by the president a couple of weeks back. Let's listen to what Venezuela's president said on Tuesday. He triggered what he calls Plan Zamora, with the arming of 500,000 civilians to ward off, in the eyes of Nicolas Maduro, a plot orchestrated by the U.S. State Department.
I am now going to sign this order of operation as the Commander-in-Chief of the National Bolivarian Armed Forces, which mobilizes all of the military, police, and civil structure of the Venezuelan state under the first green phase of Plan Zamora, in defense of internal order and peace, and to defeat the coup which has been orchestrated by Washington, and secondarily by this man, Julio Borges. I sign this document and make it active immediately.
Daniel Landsberg, should we take President Maduro at his word when he talks about the arming of civilians?
So I think that one of the fundamental issues at play here, this is sort of harkening back quickly to some of the comments Jim made right before the news sort of segment, is that there is a high degree of dependence from the opposition on social media. But that's largely a result, I believe, of the fact that all non-government aligned media has been either bought out or closed, or not given paper or access to people since. So there is a lot of disinformation on both sides, which makes it very difficult to understand what's going on in Venezuela, which I think unfortunately makes the rest of the world more likely to disengage because of that confusion, which is something that the government has used for years to its advantage. Yes, Venezuela does have an elected president, but it also has an elected legislature, which has been in power theoretically for over a year and which has not been allowed to legislate at all because the Supreme Court blocks everything on constitutional grounds. The irony being that the constitution in Venezuela right now is not worth the paper it's printed on. And I don't say that only because paper is very scarce and expensive in Caracas. Even a digital version of the Constitution is not worth the electricity for the pixels. It is a completely fictitious document at this point. You have elections that have been put off for over a year. You have elected powers that are routinely ignored and sidelined. As the constitutional powers become more porous with a ever-expanding purview for the Supreme Court, an ever-sidelined national legislature, groups are being armed, the colectivos, who are folks who are nominally allied to the government, by the government as sort of a last line of defense should people take to the streets. The real risk to the government is not that the opposition manages to go west into the western portions of Caracas, which, as was previously mentioned, used to be the parts of the city that most backed the government. The truth is that we don't know well how much they're backing the government now. A lot of those sections voted for the opposition during the legislative elections and have not seen their legislature be able to do anything. The opposition getting a group into the west of the city is risky for the government, not because it's a coup, it's because it would give an opportunity for the people whose voice is not being heard to make one last blow, the sort of decisive end of this fiction that the government has kept going far too long, that it is a majority state.
Daniel, state television showing pictures of pro-government marches as well this Wednesday. Again, I get back to my question: should we take this this plan Zamora seriously? Is he really going to arm civilians?
Can I say something from the ground?
No, sure, go ahead.
That I think that is important. I live in Western Caracas, and I can say that, yes, there are a lot of opposition supporters, around where I live, but there's also a lot of people who may not be content with the government, but they definitely do not support the opposition. And when you look at where the opposition protests are concentrated, they're concentrated where they always have been, in the wealthy eastern municipality of Chacao. And the fact is, 9 out of 10 Venezuelans do not support these kind of violent protests. When we're talking about a businessman who last week was killed at a barricade in El Paraíso, which is like 10 minutes from my house, where he attempted to penetrate it with his Jeep, and the motorcyclist, the opposition motorcyclist, shot him in the face, and he died. I mean, people do not support this kind of violent chaos, and this is exactly what the opposition is promoting in Caracas, in Lara. We can talk all the concrete cases. We can talk about the Supreme Court building in Chacao that was attacked by hundreds of demonstrators. We can talk about the veterinary clinic in Lara that was burned. We can talk about all these cases, and I mean, this is just the reality. Also referring to the militias, again, we're letting these, basically media headlines lead us. The militias are under the control of the Department of Defense, of the Defense Ministry. These are not, bands. These are very highly organized and disciplined units. And it's basically
500,000 civilians, though? Guns for 500,000 civilians?
Can I respond?
The point is the control of the Defense Ministry. And also the point is, if we're going to look at actually who has died, the opposition talks a lot about colectivos, but we haven't seen any accountability for the two people who were killed by opposition protests. We've seen accountability, at least in the case of one protester who was killed by police. We're seeing investigations of others, but there's been no evidence. There's been no cases of colectivos killing anyone so far. The opposition has actually made false allegations in the case of a police officer who was killed in Barquisimeto, and the governor of Lara State, Henry Falcon, who was opposition, disproved that it was, colectivos. And the opposition is lying. Daniel
Landsberg.
Can I respond?
Daniel Landsberg.
Please. Thank you. I think that there's one thing that there was a lot to take in there, but the fact is that when opposition protests become violent, and sometimes they do, it is generally a minority of the opposition protests that are going on. You will see aerial shots of Caracas showing hundreds of thousands of people, and then you will see a shot of maybe 30 people throwing rocks at water cannons. Every time that protests become violent, be it by the opposition or by the government's supporters, that makes the government win. It muddies the waters. It creates shades of gray where, at this stage of the game, very few shades of gray remain, which is why they get such an outsized part of the attention. The people in colectivos have been armed for years. For years.
Where's the
Kalashnikovs. that were bought from Russia that disappeared into the population, and you would see Tupamarus walking around Katia with them in broad daylight. It wasn't a strange thing to see. The people aren't being armed now, but by drawing attention, you're creating to the idea that there will be armed confrontations. It muddies the waters.
Right,
this is a war not of stones and sticks and water cannons. It's a war of disinformation, and one that the Venezuelan government has been winning for a long time.
Let me bring in on this Juan Carlos Hidalgo. Your thoughts on where it's all going right now?
Well, the problem is that the opposition doesn't have consensus when it comes to what are the objectives of this process. Some people in the opposition want elections. They don't know yet what kind of elections. Do they want the regional elections that were supposed to take place last December and that were indefinitely postponed? Other people call for presidential elections, immediate presidential elections, but as Lucas said, that will be unconstitutional. Although the Constitution is not where the paperwork is printed, as Daniel said. And other people in the opposition want the immediate departure of Nicolás Maduro from power. So as long as the opposition is not united in a common front, demanding one single thing, you will have a very ineffective opposition. You will have these protests that will take place. There will be repression. People will die. It's interesting because the regime never engages in massive repression. Let's remember the Maidan in Ukraine, when 70 people died in one single day, and that brought about the collapse of the Yanukovych regime in that country. The Venezuelan regime is smarter than that. They kill selectively. They kill one people one day, two people the other, and then they rely on alternative facts, like the ones that were being brought about by Lucas, saying, "Oh, there was a robbery. It was a police cop that was killed by the opposition." So they are very smart when it comes to how they repress, and that eventually dissuades people in Venezuela from joining the protest because they say, "What's the point?" And I'm afraid that unless we see something different today and in the upcoming days, these protests won't be any different from the protests we saw in 2012, we saw in 2014, where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Venezuelans took to the streets, but nothing changed.
Vincent, you agree?
Yes, I'd just like to clarify a little bit what Lucas was saying as to the fact that the collectives are not violent. Yes, there is proof of people being shot by the collectives, like Genesis Carmon in 2014. We're not going to go into the details, but what I wanted to say is that the militias themselves are an illegal form of that did not exist in Venezuela before. They were written into the Constitution in 2007 by Mr. Chavez himself. That referendum was rejected by the majority. So when Mr. Lucas talks about a democracy and about a president that wins all these elections, he seems to forget that in 2007, Chavez lost an election and did not recognize it, call it a victory of expletive, that Ledesma won for Caracas and was ousted too, that Manuel Rosales, Leopoldo Lopez, Henry Capriles cannot even present themselves. So trying to tell us that Nicolás Maduro is this legitimate person is not accurate.
All right, we're going to look at the impact of all of this on the region when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.